What's up, metalheads? Welcome to the Scrap Metal Podcast, a show for the misfits who've been listening to the same music since high school. I'm your host, John von Frankenstein, and joining me today is my metal thrashing mad co-host, Chris. Chris, I gotta ask you, man, how you feeling?
I gotta say, I'm feeling like a criminal.
Like a criminal? Oh, yeah. No. Criminal records. How are you going to get a job? You can only work at McDonald's. Is that wrong? Is that wrong to say? I mean no offense to anyone who works at McDonald's. I'm so sorry. I feel awful now. Chris, does this feeling of feeling like a smooth criminal, if you will, a smooth criminal on a little alien ant farm, if you will, you know, if you'd like, have anything to do with how you're keeping your heavy metal street cred?
You know, I thought we might go Fiona Apple, but that's not my street cred either. But what I have been doing to kind of sort of keep my heavy metal street cred, I've been replaying Grand Theft Auto 5.
Oh, nice.
You know, there's a great punk rock radio station in the game that I always listen to. You know, I get to listen to. I think Adolescence is in there. Off is a good band that's in there. Fear is in there. And, you know, I decided to start playing again because it was recently announced that pretty soon we're going to have a trailer for the new Grand Theft Auto game. So everyone is very excited about that. It's also bringing up the discussion that Grand Theft Auto 5 is 10 years old. And there's some of us that are like, wait, what?
Are you serious?
It's 10
years.
It's
been 10 fucking years already?
It's been 10 years since Grand Theft Auto 5 came out. And then what's crazy is that the start of Grand Theft Auto 5 has scenes that take place 9 years earlier. So there's stuff in Grand Theft Auto 5 that takes place almost 20 years ago, which makes us all feel terribly
Jesus
old.
Jesus fucking Christ.
It's
I don't even
crazy.
want to think about that.
I know. I know. But yeah, I've been just, you know, having fun listening to the music in the video games. We all know how much I love to listen to music from video games. That's where I've discovered every band I've ever listened to.
Yeah.
But yeah,
as just, well documented on this podcast.
Yes, well documented. But yeah, I've just been revisiting and kind of in a bit of shock at how old this game is.
You know what? Grand Theft Auto 5 being 10 years old, that's criminal. That's fucking awful. That's insane. Because there's such a big following around that game and just around the franchise itself. Like,
yeah.
I know, like, hardcore gamers, I'm not a gamer by any means, but I know that people were super hyped when this got announced because people have been waiting for this for fucking, it feels like 20 years.
Yeah.
That's insane. You know, I love and hate a situation where I'm suddenly meant to think about how much time has passed since like a seminal event in my life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, thinking about the fact that something like Grand Theft Auto 5 came out 10 years ago and it feels like just yesterday, you know?
Well,
people talk about how
they have re-released it like 4 times since then. So they might have released an updated version yesterday, but
so I'm not that far off. But it got me thinking about how like I will hear like, oh, Slipknot's self-titled album is celebrating its 23rd birthday, or, you know, Korn's Follow the Leader is celebrating its 25th or 26th birthday. And I'm like, 20 with a 2.
Yes.
That's 20 years. I can remember that far back.
Yeah.
And I wasn't like a baby at that point. I was a teen 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And that feels awful to say. But it got me thinking about the fact that these albums that we consider so important to us and our teenage years and our such important developmental years are 20 plus years old. We've now entered the realm of classic rock.
Yeah.
But it's very different from the classic rock that you and I grew up with. And that's the topic for today. We are redefining classic rock, going back and talking about albums that will make you go, this is how old? I'm sorry, my knees just did what? Chris, are you excited to redefine classic rock?
I am so excited to talk about redefining classic rock. Like you're saying, it's crazy to think that some of this music that we were teenagers and discovering in middle school and high school is now 20 years old. You know, I'm going to talk
It makes me
about,
sick.
I'm going to talk about bands and songs. Like, I distinctly remember where I was the first time I heard this song. And like, yeah, I was 13 years old when I heard that, and that's 20 years ago. And that's insane to me.
Yeah.
So it's fun to think that that's how I feel, and to think, well, that must be how our parents felt when like the music that they listened to 15, 20 years earlier was being called classic rock when we were kids.
Yeah.
Because like,
yeah.
I try not to do it, but there is that part of me that's like, well, everything that came out before I was born is old. It doesn't matter if it was a year before I was born. It doesn't matter if it was 20 years before I was born. It all came out before I was born, which makes it old. And I try not to do that, but it's hard to not do that sometimes when you grow up and anything that sounded old was just old to you.
Yeah. And also when the term classic is thrown in front of anything, you're just instantly going to go, oh, this is something of years past. This is something, ancient from arcane times.
Yeah.
And immediately it puts it into this light of, this is very, very old music. This is, classical music. Yeah. When you're calling something classic rock, it almost makes you feel so detached from it. Like you can't even think about the fact that it was maybe for our parents when they were listening to the songs, it was that same 15 or 20 year gap. And they're going like, wait a minute, this song isn't that old right now.
Yeah.
And it's funny, before we started recording, I wanted to make sure that Chris and I were both on the same sort of wavelength. And so I was explaining my thinking, right? And basically what I've done is now, in the year of our Lord 2023, the album that made me feel the sickest when I heard like, oh yeah, this album's 20 something years old, was Hybrid Theory by Linkin Park. Because Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory was such an important album for me growing up. This was one of the very first bands that I felt like, oh, this is a band that I found. They were gaining traction on MTV. Like, even talking about MTV makes me feel old. And I hate to say that because I sound like a Bowling for Soup song, but but it's true. MTV is not what it was 10, 15 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, when we were still getting music videos and artists were gaining traction. What was MTV then is now TikTok. But whenever I hear that Linkin Park's albums are such and such years old, I'm like, that's fucking insane. Because I grew up on these albums. I remember first seeing the video for One Step Closer. I remember the first time I heard Paper Cut on the radio on K-Rock, which isn't even a radio station anymore. So what I said to myself was, I need to be able to track this. How do I track this? How do I quantify what classic rock is to me? So I used Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory as my basis. This is my litmus test. And I said, okay, that album is 23 years old. And then I said to myself, okay, when can I first remember like having a memory of like listening to something in the car with my dad, on the radio, and saying like, wow, cool, this is classic rock. This is being played on a classic rock station. So I figured 6 or 7 years old. So let's call it 1996, 1997. If I go 23 years before that, that's 1973. So again, when you think about the fact that I'm as separated from Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory as my dad was separated from Pink Floyd's Money, or the Doobie Brothers' Long Train Running, or Steve Miller Band's The Joker. Yeah. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Because I was growing up thinking like, oh yeah, this is really old music. And Chris, I don't know if you feel the same way, but it was like Steve Miller Band, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Queen, and all these other bands. I looked at that, and Elvis was like not that far behind. I was like, oh yeah, it's kind of sort of around the same time. The Beatles and Kiss, that they're separated by like 10 years with their premieres, is insane to me. Yeah. So like, I just feel like it was all lumped in because we were listening to classic rock radio, which was kind of just pushing it all out there as like, this is all classic rock. It made it feel like it was all from the same exact era, when really even those artists were separated by 15, 20 years or so.
Yeah, definitely. Some artists I thought about was I grew up listening to Billy Joel and Bruce Springsteen. You know, that was some of the music I listened to a lot of, and I would hear it on the radio. You know, one of my first favorite songs was We Didn't Start the Fire by Billy Joel. That song came out in 1989. And so I was listening to it only a few years after it came out. And that came out when I was 1 year old. I was born in 88. The song comes out in 89. And a few years later, I'm listening to it as 4 or 5 years old. But to me, it seemed old. And I think a part of that is because by that point, Billy Joel had been around for, nearly 20 years.
Yeah.
And so Stormfront was the end of his career. That was the second to last album he released. He released that, River of Dreams, and that's it. Hasn't recorded any new music since 1993. Yeah. But by that point, he's established himself as a classic rock artist. So even though his stuff Piano Man gets played on classic rock stations because that's from 1973.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean, but then because of that, everything he's done gets played on classic rock. So even though his song might only be 4 or 5 years old, it's considered classic rock because Billy Joel is considered classic rock. And similarly with Bruce Springsteen, his first album comes out in 71 or 73, something like that. I'm listening to Born in the USA, which came out in 84. So it's a little bit older than Stormfront, but it's the same idea. Bruce Springsteen has established himself as this, again, classic rock artist who gets played on classic rock radio. So his new music is automatically considered classic rock. So I think that skewed some of my ideas as a kid of how old this music really was.
Yeah.
Because even though the artists had a long career by the time I was discovering them, their new music was being considered old to me because it's being played on the same radio stations as other old music. You could hear Led Zeppelin. Yeah. You could hear stuff, off of Zeppelin 1 on the radio, followed by stuff off of Billy Joel's River of Dreams. Those albums are separated by, decades, and yet they're both considered classic rock.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny too, because I even grew up listening to a lot of 80s music, Culture Club, fucking Karma Chameleon and shit like that, St. Elmo's Fire, fucking Gloria, all these crazy 80s songs. She Blinded Me with Science. My parents had this 80s compilation CD, and it was my favorite CD as a kid. Because I was oh, this is 80s music. I knew it as 80s music, and I understood it as something that was older than me, but that this was the music that my mom was raised on, this is what she was listening to when she was in high school and stuff. And it was really trippy to think okay, we're as separated from the 80s now as we are from, an album that came out 10 years ago, 10 or 12 years ago. It's not that long of a period.
Yeah.
And maybe it's something to do with the way that trends change so quickly and that musical tastes change and evolve so quickly that makes a lot of this music feel a lot older than it actually was.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, having something like Born in the USA and what's his first album? Asbury Park? Right?
Yeah.
Springsteen?
Yeah, it's,
how far apart are those albums?
Yeah. 17-ish years.
Okay. 17 years maybe, is a long time.
No.
That's almost a high school graduate.
No, my math is wrong.
I'm going to insert the Jeopardy theme here.
We're saying Born in the USA and Asbury Park.
Yeah.
11 years. I was adding a decade that I shouldn't have been. I was thinking of a different album, but yes.
Carry the one and then we
pretty much 11 years, because Asbury Park was 73, Born in the USA is 84. So 11 years between those two albums.
Even still, 11 years is a long time. And think about how Springsteen's music evolved within that time, right?
Yeah.
So just musical tastes in general. From 1973, like a song like Long Train Running sounds very, very old to me, even now when listening to it. A song like Jessica by the Allman Brothers. You know, just going through songs that came out in 1973, 20th Century Boy, you hear the recording of that and it sounds like a much older song.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what it was too, is we were talking about like songs that were recorded on tape, like analog. So they had this olden type sound, and that's what we were growing up as, understanding as older music, classic rock. I think what makes it such a mind trip now is that an album that was recorded in 2000 doesn't sound all that different in quality to an album that's released today. The style and the musical influences and the different the musical taste might be very much, you know, of today.
Yeah.
But quality-wise, they're pretty much the same.
Yeah.
And I think that's what messes you up so bad.
Yeah, definitely, because I've thought about it, and I feel like it's been discussed online, where I feel like from the 60s to, I'd say, the 90s and early 2000s, how we listened to our music and the technology for how we listened to and recorded music evolved in those 40 years. You know, 40 to 50 years, it evolved. We went from vinyl records all the way to listening to them digitally.
Yeah.
But since then, it hasn't changed. Yeah. So by 2004, 2005, I'm listening to a band like Linkin Park on my MP3 player. And 20 years later, I can still listen to Linkin Park digitally. The format hasn't changed in 20 years. So it doesn't feel different to us. You know, Born in the USA was one of the first, if not the first album to come out on CD. That's a huge deal.
Really?
11 years earlier, he's only coming out on a vinyl record. 1984, the first CDs are coming out. And then 20 years later, CDs are being made obsolete by iPods and MP3 players.
Yeah.
But I think I actually just read something recently, for the first time in like probably decades, vinyl has outsold CDs because
that's awesome.
Everyone is buying vinyl.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like CDs are making their way back too. You know, you've got cassette tapes.
Yeah.
CDs have to be making their way back.
Oh yeah, definitely. But it's interesting. And like I said, I think that's a big part of the reason why, for people that are our age, is that the things that we had when we were kids, the technology changed pretty quickly. Because I grew up listening to cassette tapes, and then 10, 15 years later, I have an MP3 player. And for the 20 years since I had an MP3 player, I've only listened to music digitally. So it got to a point where things changed very quickly, and then it got to a point where things haven't really changed at all. And so I think that's why you have this idea where there's a certain period of time where it's like, oh yeah, that's super old music because it came out on this format that's no longer viable after 5 years. But then you get to a point where music came out in a format that is still the preferred format 20 years later. And so that's why we're kind of like, wait, that album is how old?
Yeah.
Like, how much time has passed since that album came out?
And you know what's funny is I was thinking to myself too, like, it's not just to say that when we talk about classic rock, it's easy to say like, oh, you mean the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who.
Yeah.
But you got to remember that for us, I know in the early 2000s, late 90s, I'm listening to the radio, what's being played? Alice in Chains, Stone Temple Pilots, Nirvana. You know, you've got like, I can hear Rooster, Break Stuff, and then the next song is going to be like Plush. Then you've got something from the Smashing Pumpkins. You know what I mean? And it's like, that music was also being played on classic rock radio, or like approaching classic rock status. And those albums were less than 10 years old, some of them.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not even just that there were albums where it's like 20 plus years. That's kind of just like I needed something tangible to be able to make sense of this all, right? So yeah, that 23 years between us now and Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory was my baseline. But I remember hearing stuff like Alice in Chains, Stone Temple Pilots, Smashing Pumpkins, Nine Inch Nails, you know, and it's like, oh yeah, this is older music. And it was still like very similar in quality to what we are listening to now, but there was something different about it still. It still felt very much of the age of cassettes and the age of CDs where, yeah, like 2000, that's when we're starting to hear the whispers of like, oh, do you have a Zune? Do you have an iPod mini? You know, I like, do you remember your first MP3 player?
Yes, I had a Dell Pocket DJ.
Oh my God. Yours had a name? I think mine was just MP3 player.
Yeah, I remember me and my brother, we got them for Christmas. They were Christmas gifts. And the iPod had come out, and everyone had iPods.
Yeah, I remember like the first time I saw someone with an iPod, it was like the size of my hard drive, and they're like, "Hold on, let me click the next button." Like there were still physical buttons that you click and like hear it depress and like so that you know that you've clicked it. Oh, dude, it's like it's the wildest fucking thing. But yeah, like I know you're not big on grunge, but for me that was like music that was approaching classic rock status, and it felt like classic rock because it was older. It had like a 10-year gap, more or less, or just under a 10-year gap. And that felt like much older music. And it was also because it was like, it felt very grown up. Like I wanted to be like a grungy, like punk kind of goth kid. And I was like, okay, if I want to be like that, if I want to embody that and claim that, then I've got to listen to that style of music. And that style of music is very far away from where I am now. So, you know, even when you talk about, oh God, what is their first album called? Stone Temple Pilots. The name escapes me now, but that album's got to be 30-something years old.
Yeah.
Right? If I'm in my 30s, that album's got to be like 92, 93 maybe?
Yeah, I would assume so. Like you're saying, I don't know grunge, and I don't have the knowledge of Stone Temple Pilots, but I know that album has got to be from 92, 94, something like that. And to your point, I've heard some of that music on classic rock stations, you know, when I was younger. And it's like you're saying, we keep using the number of 20 years, but I feel like for radio, you can push it to like 10 years. If the song is 10 years old, it's considered classic rock. Because I feel like it was probably less than 10 years. I'm hearing stuff off of Green Day's American Idiot on classic rock stations. Yeah. Now, I think part of that might have been they fall similarly into like a Bruce Springsteen, Billy Joel situation. I'm pretty sure I'd heard Basket Case on classic rock. I've heard Good Riddance, Time of Your Life on classic rock. Those songs are from 94 and 97. American Idiot is from 2004. So I wouldn't be surprised if within 4 to 5 years, they're like, oh yeah, Green Day, they've been around forever, so they're considered classic rock now, and we're going to play their like absolute mellowest stuff on the classic rock radio stations.
So what you're saying is you think it has more to do with this is a well-established act that has been around for more than 10 years. So their music now falls within classic rock, even if it's an album that came out 5 or 6 years ago.
That's what it kind of feels like. You know, some of the bands were talking about. Because
that's kind of the point that you were making with Springsteen.
Yeah, is that with Billy Joel and Bruce Springsteen, you know, their new music is already considered classic rock because they're considered classic rock artists. You know, Green Day's newest music at the time, which is now approaching 20 years old. Holy shit. But they've established themselves. They've gotten radio play on classic rock stations. So it's almost like, oh, well, I like this band that's being played on classic rock radio, so let's play their newest music. It's not like Green Day was being played on classic rock 5 years after their debut album came out.
Right.
And so I think some of those things, you know, that definitely made me feel old and weird when Green Day's album that came out when I was in high school is suddenly being played on the same radio station that plays, you know, Meatloaf. But
yeah,
there's enough time has passed from when the band debuted that their newest music, it's almost like the window gets smaller as the artist, their career
has
gets
been around
longer.
for longer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you get to a point where, you know, you put out a brand new album and that album is automatically considered classic rock because the artist has been around for 40 years. So
yeah,
it's weird how it works. And so it's, I think that's why I kind of struggled with some of this, because it was like, depending on who the artist was, a different amount of time had passed between when the song or album came out and when it started getting played on classic rock radio.
Right. See, it's like, I mean, Green Day's a perfect example because you, like you said, they just reached that point where it's like, okay, now they're classic rock. It's almost as if it was just another turning point or a fork stuck in the road. And they finally said, you guys get played on classic rock radio now. I was holding that in for so long. These bits, I don't want to let them free, but they just got to fly. You know, if that makes sense. You know what's funny too is like I'll speak with Russell, our heavy metal intern, about music all the time. And I remember when I first met them and I said like, yo, I heard that you love nu metal. I heard that Slipknot is like one of your favorite bands. And they're like, fuck yeah, dude, nu metal fucking rocks. And that was like before the big nu metal resurgence that we're kind of seeing now. But I was like, oh, all right, nice. I've got someone that I could talk about nu metal with, because nu metal is now considered like classic rock.
Yeah.
You know, it's really fucking trippy when you think about the fact that, again, if we take Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory as our baseline and we say to ourselves, okay, what other hard rock or heavy metal albums came out in the year 2000? Godsmack's album Awake, which I had. It was one of my favorite fucking albums. Mur de Norms by A Perfect Circle. I don't even think I said that right. Infest by Papa Roach. Like, that's 23 years old. That's fucking terrifying. LD50 by Mudvayne.
Yes.
Like, this is, by classic rock radio standards, this is all classic rock. And this is exactly what I mean, where it's like you wouldn't think that, and it's not even just the hard rock and heavy metal. You've got something like The Better Life from Three Doors Down, Stronger Than Death by Black Label Society, like thinking about the fact that Black Label Society's been around for that long. The Sickness by Disturbed, White Pony by Deftones, one of their, arguably their biggest album. And this is all classic rock. This is stuff that now, you know, kids in their late teens, like, you know, just approaching their 20s are like, oh yeah, like my dad listened to that music.
Yeah.
When he would drive me to school. And it's like, I'm that dad. Like my son now is going to be like, oh yeah, you guys ever hear of Children of Bodom? Like they're this really cool classic metal band from the late 90s that my dad like really loved, from the late 1900s.
If I ever have some Gen Z come up to me and be like, oh, so you were born in the late 1900s? I'm punching them in the face. I don't care. I'm punching them in the face.
Yeah, man. It is so odd to think that it's what we listen to is considered classic. And like, not even just the heavy metal, like I was saying, just any of the albums that came out around that time. I got curious and I was like, okay, what emo albums might I know that came out in the year 2000? I don't know any of these bands actually, so maybe I don't know. I mean, I wasn't an emo kid. I didn't listen to fucking Dashboard Confessionals. I fucking hated them. Oh man. Hey, listen. We've always preached being open-minded, but there are some things you like and some things that you don't.
Yeah.
But yeah, Death Cab for Cutie, The Anniversary. I remember hearing that name. I know that name. I've never heard anything by them. At the Drive-In. Oh my God, At the Drive-In, who then became the Mars Volta. Okay. So quick story. I remember when I was in middle school, I used to like turn on this little alarm clock radio that I had, and I had that on my desk, and I would like spend the afternoons fucking drawing like what any kid in the 2000s drew, fucking Dragon Ball Z characters. So I'm just sitting there drawing Dragon Ball Z characters. and like Paper Cut from Linkin Park comes on, or like When Worlds Collide by Power Man 5000 just finished playing. And then on comes Bad Transmission from A One-Armed Scissor, I think was the song from At the Drive-In. And I like turn and look at my radio. I'm like, click. Yeah, I've never been a fan. I know that they turned into the Mars Volta from there, and I know people love them, but I never understood it. And I guess for me, At the Drive-In is the emo version of like when someone's listening to Jimmy Buffett and I'm like, well, I don't get it. Or Sammy Hagar. And I'm like, I don't get it. I don't understand it. It's like, I know it's being played on classic rock radio. I know it's something that's close to a lot of people's hearts, but I just don't understand.
Yeah, definitely. It's funny you mentioned all these emo bands, and those were all the bands all my friends listened to in high school, and I made fun of them for listening to their shitty emo music as I was discovering all this heavy metal. But like you're saying, it wasn't just metal. You know, some of the bands that I thought of was like the pop punk that came out in the early 2000s. You know,
sure.
Some 41's debut came out in 2000. I remember watching the music video for Fat Lip on VH1 in 2001, you know,
like the long intro one where they're rapping to the guy at the counter.
Maybe I remember the ending also had Pain for Pleasure, which was their Iron Maiden I guess homage. But yeah, it's funny to think how like this pop punk music that I'm kind of getting into again. Like I listened to some 41, I listened to some Blink-182, but now I'm going back and listening to like, it wasn't really pop punk or maybe like SoCal punk bands like Lagwagon, bands like, what's it like, Millencolin, something like that. I've been listening to more recently, and it's like all this music came out between like 1998 and 2002 or 2003. Right. So like, that's
was like MXPX and NoFX considered like pop punk?
I feel like MXPX might have been more pop punk. NoFX definitely fell more under the SoCal punk.
Okay.
You know, no,
I've never really listened to either one of them, so that's why I ask.
Yeah, I haven't listened to a lot of MXPX. I feel like I'm kind of basing it based on the people I know who did listen to MXPX, and they weren't the kind of folks that would listen to NoFX. You know, NoFX, I feel like it's weird to call them punk, but it was like 90s SoCal punk. You know, they kind of fall under the same genre like a band like Rancid would, where it's I get that. Punk. It's almost like bands in the 90s throwing it back 20 years to the punk bands of the 70s. You know, that's really classic rock. What it was. And honestly, I'm gonna always talk about how great they were in the 90s. AFI was doing the same shit on their first few albums, where they were doing the whole SoCal punk type of thing. So it's funny to talk about these bands and be like, yeah, that's considered classic rock. Like it's a 90-second long punk rock song that came out in 1997. Yeah, that's classic rock. Yeah. I'm going to call that the same thing people are calling Born to Run, you know? Yeah. And so I think that's where some of the like that it does not compute. Like there's no
the cognitive dissonance.
There's
like
no
doesn't make sense.
3-minute saxophone solo in these songs, you know? It's funny to think of it as classic rock, but like by these standards that we're setting, yes, these would totally qualify to be played on a classic rock radio station. And it's something that I thought a lot about, is a joke that I feel like you've made, and I've seen people online say it over and over and over again. Emo night for millennials is what 80s night was for our parents. That's really what it is.
I was just going to talk about that.
Is that you get to hang out at a club or a bar or whatever it is and hear the music that you loved when you were in high school. You know, I go to my millennial friend's wedding, and the music that's being played is fucking Mr. Brightside. And like everyone is like, we need to hear Mr. Brightside. And I'm like, that's an okay song, but like, this is the song, this is the music everyone our age is so obsessed with, and it's classic rock now. That's what it is now.
Yeah, dude, it's so funny that you bring that up, because I was just going to talk about how my friend Amanda has recently invited me to a new metal night that they're doing at St. Vitus. And I'm going. I'm so hyped up. And I was like, oh, like this is my version of emo night. Like people fucking love emo night, but I was an emo kid.
Yeah.
So my version is going, I'm buying a pair of fucking UFOs. I'm going to buy the fucking jelly bands and I'm going to braid my hair and I'm going to go and listen to fucking Freak on a Leash and like Limp Bizkit at her wedding, like where people are jumping around and listening to fucking Mr. Brightside. When I think about it, like when I was a kid, people were listening to like Paula Abdul and fucking Taylor Dane. Like those were the songs that they were playing at parties. And like all the people in their 20s were like, yeah, I remember when this song first came out. And now she played like Closer by 9 Inch Nails at her wedding. And it's a bunch of 30-somethings jumping around being like, I want to fuck you like an animal while someone's grandma sitting in the corner over there. It's like, oh, they didn't know what they were in for.
Yeah.
We're fucking jumping around listening to Limp Bizkit. Like that was so fucking fun because you really got to see the music that we grew up on and how it's translated where like it can be wedding music now.
Yes.
That's really fucking weird.
Yeah, it is weird.
You've got the harder and heavier stuff that is like close to my heart. I know you had like your pop punk as well that you listen to and that's really close to your heart. But something that I'm kind of curious about is the term classic rock itself. Do you think that classic rock has just become the catch-all term for music that is kind of like radio-friendly rock music that's like more than 5 years old? Is that just what we deem classic rock now?
It's a tough one because I feel like classic rock is way too generic of a term. And
right.
I think for me, when I hear classic rock, I'm thinking about Bruce Springsteen and Billy Joel and Meatloaf and Elton John and some of that stuff. And it's I think because I don't know what else to call some of these bands, that's why they end up being called classic rock. Green Day.
Yeah.
Is a punk or pop punk band. There's no reason to call them classic rock. They have a relatively well-defined genre and box that they fit in.
Right.
Emo music, even though by our definitions it could very well be considered classic rock, it's emo. Nu metal is nu metal. It fits in that title. So to call it classic rock feels weird because it already has a title. Now, if you want to call your radio station a classic rock radio station, and that just means you play rock music that's older than 10 years old, that's fine, but I think you're also going to have way too broad of a mix. Because not everyone is like you and me who's going to be like, oh yeah, I want to listen to Cannibal Corpse and I want to listen to the Beatles. Like you're not always going to find people that are going to want to listen to both of that. And so I think the classic rock radio that we still have, which I never put on the radio because they only play the same 10 fucking songs. But like, here in New York, you've got, BAB out here on Long Island. You've got Q104 that are your classic rock. For a while, and I don't know if they're still around or what they're still doing, but there was 94.3 The Shark, which was playing like 90s and early 2000s music. And that's kind of why I stopped listening to it, because I believe every other song was like Nirvana or why am I blanking on Chris Cornell's band? Black Hole Sun.
Soundgarden.
Soundgarden.
Yeah.
Oh my God, so much fucking Soundgarden. But like I did discover or rediscover, because I feel like I'd heard the song before, Glycerine by Bush, which I really liked.
Yeah.
Oh, I forget the band that does a really good cover of Simple Man. I forget the band. It's some like early 2000s.
Shinedown?
Yes, Shinedown.
Yeah.
So it's almost like if you're going to have classic rock radio, you need to have a different radio or at least a different show, depending on which decades you're considering classic rock. Because like classic rock that we grew up on was 60s, 70s, and 80s music, more or less.
Yeah.
you can't start throwing 90s and 2000s music with that music unless you're playing it in a different show or if you're playing it on a different station. You know, yes, Eddie Trunk is on Q104, a classic rock station, but he's not playing what would be considered classic rock. He's playing harder and heavier metal. It could be brand new heavy metal. It could be heavy metal from 50 years ago, but it's when you listen to Eddie Trunk, you know what you're going to listen to. And I think that's what makes it weird to say, well, what is classic rock? Because I think so much of what we're talking about today already has a label, and then it just becomes, okay, well, then what do you call the bands that were considered classic rock? Because it's, I haven't brought it up yet, but Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction comes out in 1987. And I've talked about how much I love this album, and I have no idea what genre to call it, because they kind of have like a dirtier hair metal look and a more aggressive hair metal sound, but like they approach punk rock because they've done Misfits covers. Yeah. They've covered
at least
Attitude.
On the first album.
You know, it's they have this really heavy metal sound or this fast-paced sound, but like you're not going to call them hair metal, but you're not going to call them punk. You're not going to necessarily call them heavy metal because, I mean, maybe you could, but are you going to put them in the same genre as a band like Judas Priest or Black Sabbath? Right. So I grew up hearing them on classic rock radio thinking, yeah, that's just classic rock. And again, they debuted a year before I was born. So this isn't even a band that like established themselves a decade earlier as this classic rock band. So their 1987 album 5 years later can be considered classic rock. No, that's only a 5-year-old album. And I'm growing up thinking, yes, that old classic band, Guns N' Roses, that's a year older than me. And I start the show talking about Grand Theft Auto. Welcome to the Jungle was used in the Grand Theft Auto San Andreas trailer, which came out in 2004. And to set the tone, to let you know that this game was a game set in the past, they use Welcome to the Jungle, a song that was only 17 years old at that time. And to me, at that time, I'm in high school, and I'm like, oh yeah, they're using that classic rock song, Welcome to the Jungle, that I hear on the radio all the time. And it's a year older than I am. So it's, I think sometimes you have these bands when, you know, I think similar to how Lemmy always said, hey, Motorhead is just a rock and roll band. They kind of blurred the line between genres because they were heavy metal and they were almost speed metal. And it was, some of these bands make it hard to define what they are. And I feel like artists like Bruce Springsteen and Billy Joel almost do the same thing to me because it's like they're that 1970s rock sound, but they continue to do that. And they're only that 1970s rock sound. And what do you call that then? And so I guess it's maybe we just didn't have these hyper specific genres or genre names at the time. So it just became the catch-all rock music. And then you had to define, once you get to the 90s, you're not going to call Billy Joel's debut album and, you know, Alice in Chains rock music. That's, yes, they fall under the same umbrella, but they are very different. Yeah. So it almost felt like, and I think this is something we've talked about before, maybe with like our power metal episode where it's like, what do you call this music as the genre evolves? You can't just call everything rock music. You need to come up with something new to call it. So we have, you know, nice shiny titles to call everything that's come out since then, which is why I think classic rock ends up being the title or the genre name for some of these older styles of rock music. And nothing else will ever be considered classic rock. It might get played on what's considered a classic rock radio station, but no one will ever say, yeah, that's classic rock.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, Chris. So after spending nearly 45 minutes reminding ourselves of just how old we are, why don't you give us your suggestion for this episode?
So my suggestion for this week is an artist who in some ways I think is inspired by classic rock, and that's Andrew WK and his 2003 album, The Wolf. Like I said, he's got a very arena rock sound. Makes lots of use of piano and orchestra, as well as very loud electric guitars and drums. And this album, The Wolf from 2003, has a lot of great songs on it, including Long Live the Party is a great song, Your Rules, Totally Stupid, and my favorite, his ballad, Never Let Down. So I definitely suggest people check out what would be very much considered classic rock at this point, since the album did turn 20 years old, and his debut was in 2001, so he's definitely classic rock. Everyone go check out Andrew WK and his 2003 album, The Wolf.
I love that you chose Andrew WK, because he's got such a weird fucking history. I love him. I think I sent you like a cool like video essay on him and stuff. And I love that Andrew WK's band was made up mostly of like death metal musicians who were like, yeah, we're not touring right now. We're not playing any music with our own bands right now. You guys want to go back up this guy on his fucking piano with his white t-shirt and white jeans, and he's like sweating and bloody? And they're like, fuck yeah. And so like, I love the fact that we have that connection with a classic rock album. You know, death metal. So I want to choose for you guys as my suggestion this week, the eternal classic rock album. Nothing is more classic rock than 2000's Black Seeds of Vengeance from the band Nile. These guys are classic rock defined, if you will. You know, something about the blast beats brings me back to the 60s and Ringo Starr. Something about their constant referencing of Egyptian mythology and, you know, just Egyptian characters and themes and musicality really brings me back to Egyptian times. So this is why I want to suggest Niall's album Black Seeds of Vengeance, with songs like Black Seeds of Vengeance, The Black Flame, To Dream of Great fucking songs. Really great fucking album. Go check it out. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Scrap Metal Podcast. The time has come for us to pack up our gear, but we'll be back to rock out with you in the next episode.
Stay metal, everyone.
Good night!